Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso, and I'm here with Ayavadda, and we're here to answer questions about Buddhism. So if you want us to answer some questions, you can go ahead and type them into the comments window, and as long as questions appear, we will answer them. When the flow of questions dries up, then the answers will stop and we will disappear. So hello to the people joining in so far. Hello to John, Maria, Lydia, Karuna, Manal, Victoria, and everyone else who's joining in. Hello to John. At this time we'll go ahead and start with paying homage to the Buddha. And if there's any questions by the time we're done paying homage to the Buddha, then we'll answer them. Otherwise, this will be the shortest monk chat on record. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Okay, so still not seeing any questions.
It might be the shortest.
Oh, no, we're getting a question. Do you want to go ahead and read out the questions?
Yeah. So it looks like John has a question here. Hello, John. John says, I deal with my fears by putting up lots of barriers, physical and mental. This is not so good for meditation. How to work with this? So putting up barriers for fear.
Well, to some degree it depends on what exactly you mean by barriers. I would say, though, that in the development of one's Buddhist practice, it's important to be honest with yourself. First and foremost, being honest with yourself about what's going on in your own mind, what's going on in your own heart. This doesn't necessarily mean that you need to tell everybody around you, but at the beginning, at least in the beginning, it's really critical to be willing to look at your own heart, look at your own mind, see what sort of emotions are going on, see what sort of thoughts are coming and going, see what sort of feelings and sensations are happening. And as you do that, then start to evaluate your reactive patterns. How do you tend to react to the experiences that are coming and going, both internal and external? How do you react to those? And are those reactions based upon unwholesome tendencies, such as desire, aversion, and self-centeredness? Or are they based on wholesome tendencies? Tendencies like equanimity, kindness, generosity, selflessness. So starting to evaluate where you tend to get caught up in negative reactions based upon unwholesome tendencies, and start working on reducing that. And that depends upon already being very self-aware and very honest with yourself. And look to see where you already have positive reactive patterns, wholesome reactive patterns, and work on maintaining and fortifying and strengthening those. And then start to look to see how you can start deliberately introducing more wholesome thought and emotional patterns into your mind and into your life. A classic example is the practice of loving kindness meditation and also doing acts of generosity. These are ways that we start to generate wholesome tendencies of mind. And what you'll notice is that as you do this, in the beginning it can be a little bit awkward because you're coming face to face with your own pain. You're coming face to face with all of those awkward, uncomfortable, irritating things that you've been trying to bury or avoid. So in the beginning it just might seem like you're just magnifying your pain because you're no longer turning away from or burying or ignoring it. But as you allow yourself to be fully aware of your own thoughts and emotions, then you also start to become more clearly aware of how to remove the underlying suffering. So without that sharp, clear self-awareness, then you cannot eliminate the underlying suffering. It will just keep tormenting you. It's kind of like if you go hiking and you get a bunch of thorns on the inside of your shirt. Well, you can just tell yourself everything's fine, nothing's wrong, and just keep walking around, and it will just keep bothering you. As much as you tell yourself everything is fine, you're still constantly being jabbed and scratched inside your shirt. At some point, you need to be honest with yourself that there's a problem. And once you're honest with yourself that there's a problem, then you start looking for a solution. So in this metaphor, the solution is to take your shirt off, carefully remove all the thorns and burrs before putting it back on, or put on a clean one. So in the same way, we first need to be honest with ourselves that our subconscious mind is full of thorns. And once we're honest with that, once we've faced that, then we can start getting in there and plucking the thorns out. So those are a few thoughts on this. Anything else you want to add to that?
I think that's
Okay, let's read the next question.
Okay, the next one is from Victoria, who asks, what is the role of your preceptor after you ordained? Do they give you tasks for spreading the Dhamma?
I think you can answer this one. In fact, I just gave you a task for spreading the Dhamma.
So Bhante Siddhasa is in fact my preceptor. Thank you, Bhante. The role of the preceptor, well, okay, so maybe one thing that's worth clarifying is there's two major roles that are kind of prescribed in the Vinaya for one who ordains. Those are the preceptor and the teacher, so the Acharya and the Upadhyaya. And without going into it in too much detail, but just very briefly, the preceptor you might not have much of a relationship with depending on the context. So this came up in a recent question, and in many countries and many Buddhist monasteries, the preceptor may just be the person who is presiding essentially over the ceremony, over the Sangha decision. And so that person might not give you any tasks, and you might not have much of a relationship with them, except that you do have the relationship with your preceptor of mutual care. And so what is essentially universal, at least as prescribed in the Vinaya Pitaka, the Vinaya, the book on monastic discipline. What is universal is that the person who has received ordination with the presiding of a preceptor, because the ordination is actually from the whole community, not just the preceptor, but the preceptor is the one who presents the candidate, then there's a relationship of care for that person. So, for example, attending on them. So taking care of their needs, serving for them, and attending on them when they're sick, or helping with their alms round and helping with their different daily activities. So that is there. And then also the preceptor has a role of attending on the disciple. So for example, if the disciple is sick, then the preceptor is supposed to attend on them in the same way that the disciple would attend on the preceptor under normal circumstances. Or if the candidate needs uplifting in the Dhamma or supportive conditions for their monastic life, the preceptor is supposed to help them. So encouraging them in the Dhamma, encouraging them in that way. And so that's really the main relationship that is going to be there. And then the same is true with the teacher, who could also be the preceptor, could be the same person. But the teacher is more expected, for example, to be living with the candidate. So the candidate must live with the teacher in dependency. And in that case, the teacher, who may be the preceptor or not, they may give tasks to the student. So they may give instructions. The instructions might be, for example, I think you should go to this monastery, or I think you should go here, or the person might want to do XYZ, and then they would ask permission from their teacher. So that could involve giving tasks for spreading the Dhamma, like answering this question. But it doesn't necessarily involve that. So that could be a series of things. And essentially the main relationship there is that if the teacher is telling them to do something that's against the Dhamma, then they're obligated essentially not to do that. But if it's something that's in line with the Dhamma, then there's basically an obligation to do it. I mean, it's not 100% required because it depends on what it is, but pretty much it would be really bad etiquette to not do it. So it's essentially obligated, but it's not that you're going to monk prison or something. So it's more about training in the Dhamma. It's not about like punishment or what is the necessary thing, but they may give that, and that would be expected to be followed.
Good. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question from Lydia, I assume from a live stream with maybe Ayasoma. Lydia says, in this morning's sutta study, the Buddha looked into his past lives for the causes of his good fortune. However, it was before his enlightenment. I thought he got that vision after enlightenment. Okay, looks like that's the end of the... Yeah,
yeah, so it is one of the characteristics of the night of the Buddha's awakening that he developed what's called the Tivija, the triple knowledge, or the three higher knowledges, or the three true knowledges. It's sometimes translated in different ways. So Ti meaning three, and Vija meaning knowledge. And one of those was a detailed and thorough recollection of past lives going back many, many, many eons. There's one sutta where the Buddha says he could clearly remember, what is it, 84 eons or something like that?
it was like 90 was what he's... But maybe it's...
Anyway, it's a really big number. Because an eon itself, I mean, there's different ways of calculating an eon, but an eon is at least somewhere in the area of a few 100 billion years, and probably a lot longer than that. So, and the Buddha talked about remembering many, many eons of the universe expanding and collapsing and expanding and collapsing and so on. So the way I understand that is that the night of his full awakening, the Buddha had this incredibly detailed and far-reaching recollection of past lives in literally every form imaginable in samsara. He had been literally everything except awakened. He'd been literally everything else. And he remembered in detail having been literally everything except awakened. Prior to his full awakening, there are a few hints here and there that the Buddha had already, like the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be, had already started to develop some minor, limited, supernormal abilities, which would include some patchy past life memories. But it's not really gone into in any detail that I can recall. So the way I relate to that is that, yeah, probably in the course of the Buddha's practicing before awakening, he might have had some brief, limited past life recall. What was different the night of his awakening is that his past life recall the night of his awakening was vast, far-reaching, incredibly detailed, and encompassed the entire scope of possible states of existence in samsara. It's like the difference between reading one page of the encyclopedia versus reading the entire encyclopedia cover to cover. Do encyclopedias even exist anymore?
Pretty sure, but I'm probably just collecting dust.
Yeah, when I was a kid, we had actually two encyclopedias in my house. One of them was post-World War II, and the other was pre-World War II. And this was important because World War II was such a major change in how the world operated that encyclopedias were basically totally different. Point being, an encyclopedia was something that took up an entire bookshelf. I say that because these days, Teneri, have you ever seen a paper encyclopedia, like an actual full encyclopedia set printed in books? No. Okay, yeah, encyclopedias are obsolete technology, so this is why I explained what an encyclopedia is. Basically, it's supposed to be a grand compendium of all knowledge about everything in the world, more or less, which takes a lot of books. So yeah, so as I see it, before the Buddha's awakening, he might have had a few little glimpses of past lives, like reading one page from an encyclopedia. But the night of his awakening was like the entire contents of the encyclopedia appearing in his mind all at once, in every detail. So that's the difference there. Do you have any thoughts on this? Have you looked into this particular topic?
I mean, the only thing that comes to mind to me is not related to past lives, but it would, I guess, go with what you're saying, Bhante, about there is actually one tiny sutta where the Buddha he talks about how before he was awakened, he was essentially investigating karma and seeing different devas. And he says that he didn't declare his awakening until he had clarified this fully.
Mm.
But in the sutta, if I remember correctly, it kind of implies or says directly that for many days he was actually having experiences of different beings and then also talking to them about how they got there.
Mm.
And so it kind of implies that, yeah, it wasn't all necessarily in one, like, that knowledge had been something that he had experience with before. So the same could be true of the other things, yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed that I've encountered a few people who seem to have this idea that, like, the Buddha was just kind of the Buddha to be, the Bodhisattva was just kind of doing his thing, and then just one day, poof, like that was it. He was fully awakened, just like a finger snap. He went from nothing to 100%. But that's not the feeling that I actually get from reading the suttas. The feeling I get from the suttas is that the Buddha was practicing and gradually building up the requisites of awakening. It's just, of course, he was already starting at the level of literal child prodigy. So he was already 99% of the way there. So he did gradual practice, but he didn't actually have that much left to do. So in the course of 7 years, he did what takes the rest of us about 700 lifetimes. More or less. Hopefully less. Okay, let's move on.
Okay, so we have another
You can just tap to click.
Yeah. This? Yeah.
Middle.
Oh, middle. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we're learning about technology. So Vanessa says, is there a specific book that comes after In the Buddha's Words by Bhikkhu Bodhi? I am almost finished and would like to continue my studies on the Pali Canon. Thank you.
I don't think so.
I think he recommends the Majjhima Nikaya. I think that's what he recommends.
That's what I usually recommend as well.
Unless, well, he does have his new one on the Noble Truths, Noble Path. That could be a little bit more advanced, but it's...
I think realistically, if you've read In the Buddha's Words, you should just start reading through the full sutta collections cover to cover. It's a really powerfully transformative experience. So yeah, Majjhima, Samyutta, and Anguttara. Those are the three really critical ones to read through. Middle length, connected, and numerical.
Okay, we have greetings from Bhumika, Jayanta, Sarah. And Lydia also asks, is it difficult managing the monastery, adding problems that householders have to deal with, like roof or plumbing problems?
Why, yes, it is. Yes, thank you for asking. Lydia, would you like to join the lay committee who's going to take over those problems for us? That would be great. Next question.
Yeah, I think so. That is either a coincidence or conditioned
pretty
by some other
remarkable
things.
Coincidence.
Manny asks a question. Lante, if daily practice of meditation and keeping precepts doesn't improve our situation or suffering, is there anything else that we could try? Thanks.
Yeah, so practice kindness. Actively search for ways to be kind and generous. Go out of your way to do good things for other people. Keep in mind that the root cause of all suffering is self-centeredness. So, actively work against your self-centeredness. And you'll find that your suffering starts evaporating all by itself. Also, relax. Don't take yourself so seriously. Okay?
And John asks, what is the difference between katanyuta and katavedita? Do these just refer to acts, or could we also be grateful for material possessions or safety? How to cultivate these?
Do you want to answer this?
Okay, sure. Well, my understanding of these words is that they're basically synonymous. So katanyuta means, they both mean, for those who don't know, because it's actually not translated here, they both mean something like gratefulness or more like gratitude. Yeah, gratefulness, gratitude. And katanyuta means essentially the knowledge or recognition of what's been done. And katavedita is a synonym. So like the verb knew here, the word in the root here, katanyuta. You have kata, which means done, nyu, which means one who knows or knowing, and ta, which means makes it into a kind of a type of noun. You don't need to go into the grammar too much. And so katanyuta means knowing what's been done, essentially. The knowing of what's been done. Whereas kata vedita, sometimes this verb here, vedita, can also mean to know something. So this should be known. Vedita bang, this should be known. So they essentially mean to know what's been done, kata, recognizing what's been done. And does it just refer to acts? Probably you're asking because of the word kata here, which means what's been done, as I said. And my understanding, again, would be that it's not just acts. It's more that the word means, has the etymology of knowing what's been done, but the sense of it is gratitude. And so, for example, material possessions or safety, can we be grateful for that? If it's something like, oh, you have a house, well, part of gratitude would be gratitude for the house, also recognizing that you're not the only person who has made that possible. So you can also recognize, for example, in being grateful for a home, you are actually being grateful for what people have done, like that they've built the home for you, for example. So, or being grateful that other people help support you in purchasing the home, or other people help support you in finding and selecting it. So material possessions aren't existing in a vacuum, but rather they exist in our connection with other beings and other people. And so I would say that gratitude as a concept, probably in the words themselves, would extend to more than just actions. But even if you didn't extend it to more than actions and you took it in that more restricted sense, then still I think actually by reflecting on how other people are intertwined and enmeshed in all the possessions and safety that we have, then we can actually be grateful for those actions by being grateful for the possessions and safety and other things. So that's what comes to mind, at least for me, on the meaning of the terms and then how to cultivate them. I think one would be just as a meditation practice, like reflecting, for example, what am I grateful for? This has actually become pretty common, I think, a very common practice of gratitude, and I think that that's really wholesome. So asking, what am I grateful for? Because especially if we have a tendency to be complaining or to take things for granted, then it might not naturally spring to mind. Even if we ask the question, it might take a little bit. So turning it into an actual meditation practice, just as we do silanusati, recollection of our virtue, or chaganusati, recollection of our generosity or charity. In the same way, I think we can do this practice of how can I recollect what other people have done and the things in my life that I'm grateful for, that are privileges, that make me safe and secure and able to practice the Dhamma. Part of this, by the way, I would actually add in would be, for example, in recognizing gratitude, you can turn that into a recollection of sila. Because one of the aspects of the Buddhist teachings is, let's say that you have a very safe, comfortable situation with supportive friends and family who have made that possible. Well, probably then that is due to what you've done in past lives that you don't necessarily recognize now. So some of it you might be able to recognize immediately in this life, but the fact that these conditions are present to you and that they've been accessible and possible means that you were probably virtuous and generous and doing all those things. So part of gratitude is recognizing, oh, this is really something reminding me of the value of virtue and also the power of virtue. Because you might not be able to see immediately that connection, but if you have faith in it and you start to recognize all the things that are in your life that are nice, that are supportive, then it might help encourage you in that virtue and uplift your mind and inspire you to create more good karma, to do more good things, because you recognize that it's actually very helpful and you appreciate it more. You don't take it for granted. Because if you take it for granted, then you might be like the story in the suttas. There's a husband and wife, and the husband didn't want to give any alms food to the monks, and the wife said, we're just living off the old merit. We're living off the old donations that we gave, but we're not giving any new ones. So how are we going to have this prosperity in the future? So the point is that the wife, she was actually very grateful for what she had, and so therefore she gave. Whereas the husband was just taking it for granted. So then he wasn't being generous because he just assumed that he deserved this or that this is what was available to him. So I think practicing the recollection of your virtue, gratitude would kind of go hand in hand with that, and recollection of the results of virtue, recollection and the results of our karma. And so that could be one way of going about it. I don't know, Bhante, if you have.
That's good. That's good. Can we go to the next one?
Okay, this looks like A little bit of a long one. So Scott says, regarding impermanence, we are taught anything that has a beginning has an ending. However, I have also received teachings that once Buddhahood is attained, it is a permanent, albeit dependent arising, which would therefore be empty of inherent existence. Since Buddhahood would have had a beginning, would it not also have an eventual ending? Please comment.
Okay, so
Should I move it to a couple of places? Or?
yeah, you can go ahead and close it.
Okay.
So, Scott, one thing that I would caution you about is getting too much into speculation about the actual experience of an awakened being. What the Buddha mostly focused on was how to get there. The Buddha didn't actually give much description of the first-person perspective of an awakened being. He mostly talked about how to get there. And when confronted with questions of this sort, the Buddha mostly refused to answer them because he said the answers are not useful. And that even if you sat and thought about this for 100 years, you would still never come to a satisfying answer. So, to put it in another way, the concepts of permanent and impermanent don't have any relevance to an awakened being. The concept of existence and non-existence don't have any relevance to an awakened being. These concepts are only relevant to unawakened people. So for unawakened people, it's very important to recognize the impermanence of all things, because that inclines the mind towards awakening. Regarding the Buddha, I would also say that there is no thing which is permanent. So what do we mean when we say a Buddha? Well, if you're talking about a body, well, bodies are not permanent. If you're talking about a specific feeling, well, feelings are not permanent. If you're talking about a specific perception, or a certain mental object, or a certain state of awareness, well, none of that's permanent either. Those are all temporary experiences. So if by the Buddha you mean the Buddha's body or the Buddha's thoughts or the Buddha's sense of eyesight or something, well, that's clearly all impermanent. So what is it that you actually mean when you say that Buddhahood is permanent? What is it that you're saying is permanent? So, yeah, it just feels like the wrong question. The question you're asking just doesn't seem like the right question. The right question would be, how can I become awakened? That's the right question. And your question, does Buddhahood have a beginning and an end? Well, I would actually say it doesn't have either. I would say that talking about Buddhahood as having a beginning or an end is totally missing the point, because it's actually not relevant. What is relevant is to understand that Nibbana is a fundamental aspect of reality, and it can be experienced if we direct the mind towards it. And when it's fully experienced, then all suffering vanishes. And one has a clear understanding of the true nature of reality. So it's not that Nibbana comes or goes. It's not that it can be described as permanent or impermanent, but rather it's a basic building block of reality, and it can be experienced if one creates the proper conditions. And that's what the path of Buddhism is all about. It's about training the mind to be able to let go of every obstacle that keeps us from awakening. Yeah, so I wouldn't worry too much about these kinds of philosophical questions, because they're actually much less useful than one might think. Okay, you want to see the next one? We have another long and probably irrelevant question from Scott.
Let's see, so Scott says, Bante, we are taught that the only independent, unconditioned aspect of our existence is our unconditioned consciousness, which has existed since beginningless time. Anything and everything more than that, including our subtle mind, is due to karma. Perhaps this is where my understanding of the subtle mind needs work. If we trace the existence of our subtle mind, i.e. of our unconditioned consciousness plus karmic imprints, backwards throughout the countless eons, we would ever... Okay, I don't know where the other part of the question is, but...
So, Scott, I don't know where you're getting these teachings from, but they're not Buddhism. So, I don't know... So this concept of an unconditioned consciousness that has existed since beginningless time, that's not Buddhism. Yeah, I don't know where you got that from, but it's not from the Buddha. So there's no point in me talking about the characteristics or details of the unconditioned consciousness because there's nothing there to talk about. It's not in the context of Buddhism. Unless you've taken a Buddhist context and renamed it, in which case you would need to explain exactly what you mean by unconditioned consciousness. I also don't know what you mean by subtle mind. So you would also need to explain what you mean by that term. That's also not found in the early Buddhist teachings. Yeah, what we see, when we look at our experience, what we see is we see consciousness arising and ceasing. That's all we ever see. We don't see anything persistent. We don't see anything with any ongoing substance or ongoing reality. We just see arising and ceasing. So consciousness is also constantly arising and ceasing. Old moments of consciousness vanish and new moments of consciousness appear. There's nothing persistent and ongoing. Okay, next question.
Well, this isn't a question, but it looks like Lydia says, I will email you to see if I can help with the monastery problems from California.
Dude, that's very sweet. I don't know how much you can do from California, but I do appreciate the thoughtfulness.
Sadhu. Okay, so Gregor says, what do you think of Satipatthana meditation, Mahasi Sayadaw technique? Is it better to do Samatha and Vipassana together?
I think the method itself is okay, but it doesn't function particularly well by itself. It functions quite well as part of a larger toolkit, including many other methods, including some more samatha-focused methods, as well as methods for dealing with various particular defilements. But I personally don't feel, and this is based upon both personal experience and also having met many decades-long Mahasi practitioners, my experience has been that it does not function as one's sole and only meditation method. But it does work quite well as an augment to other methods, or in addition to other methods. And is it better to do samatha and vipassana together? Well, it's quite clear in the early discourses that you need both samatha and vipassana. You cannot attain awakening with only vipassana. This is very clear in the early suttas. Without samatha, vipassana is never strong enough or deep enough. It's only ever superficial. And again, this has been my observation with people who try to do non-samatha strategies, vipassana-only strategies, is they practice for decades without really getting that deep. And this, again, is exactly what the Buddha would have said. It's exactly in line with how the Buddha talked about practice. So you need both samatha and vipassana. There's really no getting around it. And I don't know why you'd want to get around it anyway. Samatha is great. Samatha is really nice. Okay, next question.
Okay. So Mao says, asking for my friend, is there a correlation between the jhana stages and the stages of enlightenment?
There's nothing explicitly mentioned in the early discourses. There's a lot of speculation in some of the apocryphal sources around this, but the early suttas don't. What we do see in the early suttas is that some amount of jhana does seem to be necessary for full awakening. But exactly how much doesn't seem to be specifically stated anywhere. And there doesn't seem to be a direct correlation between stages of jhana and stages of awakening. Are you aware of anything on this topic?
Well, there are some suttas that talk about non-returners and jhanas. like, yeah, but I don't know. There's a couple ones, but I don't know if I remember the number. But there's one in the Majjhima Nikaya, I think in the 60s maybe, where the Buddha's talking about giving up the 5 lower fetters, and so which would be the stage of non-returner, and he talks about jhanas. So that's, but it's not correlated to like a particular one in there or anything like that. But this would make sense because non-returners are said to be free of sensual defilement, sensual craving, and like coarse aversion, which are the main obstacles. So that's kind of correlated in the suttas, but that's really the extent of what I can remember at the time, for the time being.
Yeah, I mean, that is a clear connection in that as one makes progress towards awakening, then because one has fewer defilements, then it will become much easier to enter jhana. And also, as one practices with jhana, then entering jhana requires that one know how to weaken one's defilements. So then that also will make it easier to attain stages of awakening. So there is a connection, but it's not really clearly, specifically mapped out, like numerically or graphically, that I can think of. Okay.
And so Robert says, a couple weeks ago you mentioned that it would be good to learn to eat foods that cause cravings to investigate instead of giving them up fully. Cravings to investigate. Oh, cause cravings to investigate instead of giving them up fully. Why is food that causes craving different than, say, sexual contact or music, which I would imagine you would suggest it is best to give up fully?
Okay, I don't actually remember exactly what I said. So what is interesting is there's one discourse where it's mentioning how one can use food in order to go beyond the craving for food. And in that sutta, it also mentions how, on the other hand, with sexuality, it's completely useless. The only option, in Pali, it uses the idiom burning the bridge. That's the only option. Burn the bridge. Destroy the bridge. Which means don't go there. So basically, in progressing towards awakening, you still need to eat. You have to keep your body alive and reasonably healthy in order to be able to continue practicing. But you don't need to have sex, and you don't need to listen to music. Those are completely useless for the path to awakening. Food is useful to the extent that it helps you stay alive and healthy. So let's see, eating foods that cause craving instead of giving them up fully. Well, actually, if your cravings are really strong and intractable, then it's probably better to just avoid those foods if you can. Develop a healthy diet that doesn't include the things that are overwhelming temptations for you. Or if the craving is less strong, then you could try to learn how to eat those foods with a calm and peaceful mind. So rather than going into the shark at a feeding frenzy kind of mode, see if you can eat those foods slowly, calmly, and peacefully. See if you can eat those foods with a serene mind, rather than a mind driven by craving for the next delicious bite. See if you can experience the taste without experiencing obsession for the taste. That's a way of practicing with it. So you can't cut food out of your life entirely, or else you literally die, which is not very helpful. But we do need to learn how to eat food in a way that does not inflame our defilements. And yeah, that sometimes means avoiding certain things altogether until our practice is stronger. And other times it means training ourselves to eat certain foods with a peaceful mind rather than an obsessive mind. Okay?
Okay. So you said one of two, but let's move on. Oh, no, there's two.
keep
Okay.
going.
Tanik says, how would you suggest us to learn conversational Pali?
You want to answer that?
I probably wouldn't, because you wouldn't have many people to converse with. So it would be pretty difficult to learn, and it would also be difficult to maintain and practice. But I would say though, if you already know Pali, I would say just start with learning to read Pali. That's the number one skill that you need to have. And then if you really want to, for some reason, like if you just feel very interested in Pali, then you could go into writing Pali. That would be the next skill to learn, because that actually is something that monks mostly do, actually sometimes do. And then from there, what I would recommend you do is memorize lots of suttas for their own benefit. And then also by memorizing and reciting them, you'll have more familiarity actually pronouncing Pali fluently, learning to understand it as you speak it. And if you learn to write, you already have the ability to compose in Pali, so then you can combine those skills. So once you know how to compose in Pali through writing and also how to pronounce it fluently, then you just need to pronounce fluently what you compose in the mind. So that would be one way of going about it, but I wouldn't probably suggest it if you say, how would I? And then Tamnik also says, is it a waste of time to learn Pali then, or should we just sit?
It is not a waste of time to learn Pali. Actually, if you really want to catch all of the subtleties and nuances of the Buddhist teachings, you basically have to learn Pali. So no translation is ever sufficient. It's enough to get a general idea. So reading the suttas in translation is enough to get the general idea, but you will never get the subtleties and nuances unless you read the suttas in Pali. So I actually do personally think that, one, it's really important to read through all the suttas. At least once in your life, you should read through all the suttas in any language. It doesn't matter. You need to do it at least once. And then, if you want to get the subtleties and nuances, then you learn Pali and read them in Pali. And for me, this has been something which has helped enormously in understanding the Dhamma. There's a tremendous amount of incredibly refined information in the suttas, which you can only really capture if you read them in Pali. As for just sitting, I'm going to quote Ajahn Chah on this one. Ajahn Chah said, there's a lot of chickens that sit for hours and hours and hours every day, but none of them attain awakening. So no, you should not just sit. It's not that easy. Okay, let's go.
Okay. HPD says, can you please speak on the difference between love and compassion?
Well, it depends on what you mean by love and what you mean by compassion. If by love you mean metta, which you might call ideal love, metta is the genuine, unreserved, unrestricted wish for all beings to be happy. That's about as close to true love as you can possibly get. Unconditional, unrestricted, boundless love for all sentient beings. May everyone be happy. No conditions, no restrictions, no boundaries. That's it. That also includes yourself, by the way. So if you're practicing metta, if you're practicing genuine love properly, then that also means that you should not make yourself a doormat. You should not put yourself in harm's way. You should not let other people take advantage of you, because then you would not be practicing love towards yourself. Compassion, if by that you mean karuna, compassion is more specifically the wish for beings to be free of suffering. So it is a little more refined of a concept than metta, because it comes with an element of wisdom. The wisdom which recognizes the suffering of the world. The wisdom which recognizes the suffering that people are experiencing. And that is coupled then with the benevolent wish for those beings to be free of that suffering. And ideally, it also manifests in action. So if you're actually practicing love and compassion correctly, then it expresses itself through deeds. If you're like, oh, may everyone be happy, and then you don't do anything, well, then clearly that thought is not very strong. May everyone be free of suffering, but I don't care about anybody else, so I'm not actually going to do anything to reduce their suffering. It's like, well, that means your compassion is still very weak. So training the mind in compassion means more than just thinking happy thoughts. It means actually doing genuine good deeds for people and noticing how that transforms the heart. Okay.
Okay, and HPD also says, please comment on this sutta from Niti Uttaka, but I think
So HPD, if you send the sutta reference to the monastery email, then we'll put it on our list for an upcoming sutta study. Yeah, thank you for the recommendation.
And Ton Nick says, is it true that Buddha gave 8 precepts at first and shortened it to 5?
You can answer this one.
No.
Do you want to go into some more detail?
I mean, I'm not sure what else there is to say. It's not true. And I mean, if you want to take the 8 precepts, though, and that motivates you, then I guess you could imagine a scenario that the Buddha did do that. But, I mean, I guess briefly speaking, there's no chronological description in the suttas of the Buddha, really much of his teachings. There's a little bit of chronology, mostly in the Vinaya, of the Buddha attaining awakening, and then the story is basically built around him establishing the monastic order. So that's really what that chronology is made to convey. And it includes narratives basically from the Buddha's awakening and then forward. And he gives a little bit of narrative before. So you could say, possibly, that the first thing the Buddha did in terms of precepts was establish the monastic order. Now, technically, he didn't really, in the narrative, he didn't actually establish official rules, but there were certain expectations of monastics that would have been understood at the time, and that would have been essentially the 8 precepts, at least, you could say. Probably also the 10 precepts would have just been expected of the monastics at the time, more or less, with a little bit of nuance here and there about certain details and so on. But yeah, and then in terms of the 8 and the 5, though, there's no chronology about him teaching that. And in many places, the Buddha taught the quote-unquote 10 precepts, the 10 kusala kammapata, so 10 pathways of wholesome action. And I believe in Tibetan Buddhism and some traditions of Buddhism, that's actually emphasized more than the 5 precepts, though the 5 are also very important because they're precepts, whereas the 10 paths of wholesome action are more suggestions and prescriptions. They include also more details about right speech and so on. But yeah, there's no chronology of how he taught these things. But he did recommend 5 precepts, you could say, for life, and 8 precepts on the Uposatha days. So he recommended everyone follow the 5 precepts. And he said that, for example, a stream enterer is essentially secured in the 5 precepts. So they naturally incline towards the 5 precepts. Whereas the 8 precepts are something that he recommended lay people take on Imposita days, and then more if they want to. Okay, HPD asks, can you please also recommend sutras or practices that cultivate wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, well, you should read all the suttas cover to cover. That's actually an incredible way to cultivate wisdom. Read through all the suttas. And you'll have a very comprehensive understanding of what the Buddha said. Other things that cultivate wisdom, actually the Buddha gave some very practical advice. In the suttas, the Buddha says the condition that leads to the arising of wisdom is, from time to time, go to monks and priests and ask them questions. The Buddha was very practical. This is one of the things that I adore about the suttas, is it's full of just really practical stuff. What's the condition for the arising of wisdom? Go to monks and priests and ask them questions. It's really good advice. So that's what I'd recommend. You're off to a good start since you're joining this monk chat. Okay?
Okay. And Anthony gave the sutta, the Mahamanukya Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 64.
I could maybe put that on the list. Yeah.
And HPD also asks, is there a book that I can have to read through the suttas?
You can explain.
The suttas,
Yeah.
those are the book. So you can purchase Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations from Wisdom Publications. Just so you know, if you got his translations from Wisdom, it would be over $300. So that can be quite expensive. But you could start also with something like In the Buddha's Words, which was mentioned previously. In the Buddha's Words by Bhikkhu Bodhi at Wisdom Publications. Or you could get one of the books, like the Middle Length Discourses by Bhikkhu Bodhi from Wisdom Publications. But those are some books. The other option is you could get the freely available ones on Sutta Central. That's a website, and Bhikkhu Bodhis are also available for some translations, the ones that are not copyrighted. But if you want to get a physical hard copy, then yeah, you probably want to get Bhikkhu Bodhis from Wisdom Publications. Okay, and Sud asks, do you think there is any benefit in meditating while still enjoying the lay life and the usual things like movies, hanging out and traveling, enjoying good food, etc., or is it just counterproductive to do so while also meditating for hours daily?
Well, there's actually a great story from the Catholic monastic tradition, which comes to mind when I hear questions like this. So there was a monk Catholic monk again in the story, remember. So this Catholic monk went to the abbot of the monastery and he said, is it okay for me to smoke cigarettes while I'm reading my prayers? And the abbot said, no, of course not. Go and read your prayers. So the monk went back and he was sitting with the other monks reading his prayers, and he saw the monk next to him smoking a cigarette. And he asked him, how did you get permission from the abbot to smoke cigarettes? And the other monk said, I asked the abbot, is it okay to read prayers while I'm smoking cigarettes? So notice the difference here. So if you tell me, oh, is it okay to watch movies and enjoy sensuality while doing meditation? It's like, well, ideally, better not to. Because basically what you're doing is with one hand, you're reducing your defilements, and with the other hand, you're increasing them. So is that counterproductive? Yeah, from one perspective, it's not great. If you really just want to make swift progress in your practice, then you just focus on reducing your defilements and you try to stop increasing them. On the other hand, if you're going to be increasing your defilements anyway, which is the case with most lay people, then yeah, it is good if you also do something to decrease your defilements. So rather than just constantly heaping up more and more causes of suffering in your life, try to also reduce them a bit. So, I hope that answers your question. Yep. Okay.
Okay, and Tom Nick asks.
Tap.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. Interesting. There was a set of precepts with disallowing harsh speech, frivolous speech, backbiting, and having right livelihood, and not disallowing alcohol. Can you explain more on that?
It sounds like an agenda here. I've seen this strategy before. You can explain this one.
Okay. Well, I do wonder if this is the 8 lifetime precepts, which I believe are given in the Burmese tradition sometimes, Bhante, is that?
I've seen it in the Bhavana Society book. I don't know if it's anywhere else.
Okay. Yeah, so I would say, without getting into speculation on that in the teachings of the Buddha that we find in the suttas and so on, there's no precept about, for example, wrong livelihood for lay people. But there is the training and the teaching that wrong livelihood leads to suffering. So, for example, if you don't want to have horrible remorse and people dislike you and then maybe you have a bad rebirth, well, then you wouldn't want to do that. But it's not that you're going to get slapped on the wrist if you do wrong livelihood. It's more that you're creating bad karma for yourself and you're creating your own suffering. So it's not exactly a precept in the way that we would think about a rule, but rather it's a suggestion and a teaching because it's more complicated, because livelihood is messy and complicated. But what the Buddha gave as precepts are the 5 precepts, because these are much more simple. So something like, don't drink alcohol. That is a precept that the Buddha gives. And it's something that you can say. So I undertake the precept not to drink alcohol, as a kind of simplification of it, right? So that is a precept in the sense that you just don't drink alcohol. You just don't take it. So things like frivolous speech, well, sometimes it's very complicated to have a hard line on what's frivolous speech, right? Because sometimes we need to do some small chat, sometimes we need to talk about things that aren't about Dhamma because we need to survive in the world. So it's recommended from the Buddha, if you don't want to suffer, if you want to progress in your practice, don't speak frivolously, but it's not a precept, as given by the Buddha himself. So things like harsh speech, frivolous speech, and backbiting, these are included in right speech. And then right livelihood is included in the Noble Eightfold Path. And then disallowing alcohol, that is included in actually the 5 precepts. So that would be what comes to mind in just terms of sets of precepts and how those are disallowed.
Good.
HPD says, can I read the suttas cover to cover on Sutta Central?
Yeah, you can. It's mostly Bhante Sujatra's translations, but there's also a number of other translators available. Also translations in various other languages as well. Yeah, that's a good resource. And that looks like the last question. So we'll go ahead and conclude the session for this evening. So thank you for all your wonderful questions. And if you have more questions, you can save them for Monk Chat next week. So we'll conclude with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.